I'm Lieutenant Commander Pauline Wilkins, 34, and I built my career in naval special warfare the hard way, through missions most people never hear about and fewer survive. For years, I sent money home, covered bills, and bent my schedule around family needs, all while keeping quiet about what my service really meant. But when my mother stood in front of 30 people, smiled, and called me nothing but a disappointment right before introducing her new husband as the real success story, I drew a line. What happened next, when he looked at me and whispered, "Black Widow," changed everything. Have you ever been cut down, humiliated, or underestimated by someone you gave everything to? If so, drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being dismissed or betrayed, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened after that moment might surprise you. The freedom was intoxicating, and I wasn't eager to give it up for the promise of a relationship that might not actually change. Dick reached out again 6 weeks after his first letter, this time with a more specific request. The annual Marine Corps birthday ball was approaching, and he wanted to invite me as his guest. Not as my mother's daughter, but as a fellow service member whose record had earned his professional respect. "I know this puts you in a difficult position with your mother," he wrote. "But I'd like the opportunity to introduce you to some people who would appreciate meeting the Black Widow, if you're comfortable with it." The invitation intrigued me for reasons that had nothing to do with my mother. Military social events were different from civilian parties. They operated on clear protocols, where respect was earned through service rather than social manipulation. It would be refreshing to spend an evening among people who understood the language of duty and sacrifice. I accepted, with conditions. I would meet Dick at the venue, arrive and leave independently, and make no commitments about family reconciliation. This was professional courtesy between service members, nothing more. My mother found out about the invitation through Dick, and her reaction was immediate and predictable. She called Shelley in a panic, demanding to know why I was going behind her back to attend social events with her husband. "She's being vindictive," my mother told Shelley. "She's trying to turn Dick against me." The accusation revealed everything about my mother's worldview. She couldn't imagine that Dick's respect for my service was separate from his feelings about her, or that my acceptance of his invitation had nothing to do with their relationship. In her mind, every interaction was a power play in the ongoing drama of family politics. But I wasn't playing family politics anymore. I was accepting professional recognition from someone whose opinion mattered in the military community where my reputation was built. The Marine Corps ball was held at the Marriott downtown, in a ballroom filled with active duty Marines, veterans, and their families. The dress code was formal, military dress blues or civilian black tie, and the atmosphere carried the weight of tradition and earned respect. Dick met me at the entrance, wearing his dress blue uniform with 28 years of ribbons displayed across his chest. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked comfortable and confident, in his element among people who shared his understanding of military service. "Thank you for coming," he said, offering his arm in the formal manner appropriate for the occasion. "There are some people I'd like you to meet." The introductions were careful and respectful. Retired generals who knew my commanding officer. Active duty colonels who'd worked with SEAL teams in joint operations. Marine Corps veterans who understood what my call sign represented, even if they couldn't know the specific missions that had earned it. "The Black Widow," said a retired brigadier general, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "I've heard about your work in Afghanistan. Outstanding service." These were people who measured accomplishment by different standards than my mother's social circle. They cared about mission success, casualty rates, and the willingness to accept dangerous assignments for the greater good. They didn't need explanations or justifications for why military service mattered. They understood it instinctively. For 3 hours, I was surrounded by people who saw my career as something significant and valuable. Not because they were trying to make me feel better, but because they had their own experience with similar challenges and understood what it took to meet them successfully. The evening confirmed something I'd been learning over the past months. My value wasn't determined by my ability to gain my mother's approval. It was determined by my willingness to serve effectively in situations that mattered, among people who understood what service meant. Dick walked me to my car afterward, his manner still formal, but warmer than our previous interactions. "I hope this was worth your time," he said. "It was. Your mother doesn't understand why I respect your service more than I approve of her treatment of you," he said quietly. "She thinks military people should stick together regardless of family dynamics." The comment revealed the fundamental conflict in Dick's position. He was caught between his professional respect for my record and his personal relationship with my mother, trying to navigate loyalties that pointed in different directions. "Military people do stick together," I said. "But that doesn't mean accepting disrespect from anyone, including family members." He nodded slowly, understanding the distinction. Military loyalty was earned through shared sacrifice and mutual respect, not demanded through blood relations or social expectations. "She wants to make things right with you," he said. "But she doesn't know how to do it without admitting she was wrong about everything." "Then she has a problem," I said. The conversation ended there, but Dick's words stayed with me. My mother wasn't struggling with how to apologize. She was struggling with how to apologize without accepting responsibility for the damage she'd caused. She wanted to restore our relationship to its previous state, where I provided financial and emotional support while she maintained the right to criticize my choices publicly. But that arrangement was no longer available. Too much had been said, too much had been revealed, and too many people had witnessed the dynamic she'd been comfortable with in private. Over the following weeks, my mother's attempts at reconciliation became increasingly desperate. She sent birthday cards with handwritten notes about misunderstandings. She had Shelley relay messages about family traditions and holiday plans. She even tried calling from different numbers, hoping to catch me off guard. But every attempt revealed the same fundamental problem. She wanted forgiveness without change. She wanted to resume our relationship without addressing the patterns that had made it unsustainable. The breaking point came when she showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, tears in her eyes and a speech prepared about family loyalty and second chances. "I know I hurt your feelings," she said, standing in my doorway like a door-to-door salesperson pitching redemption. "But we're family. Family forgives each other." The phrase, "hurt your feelings," reduced years of financial exploitation and public humiliation to a minor emotional inconvenience. It was the kind of minimization that had characterized our entire relationship, the refusal to acknowledge the actual impact of her behavior. "You called me nothing but a disappointment in front of 30 people, I said. "That wasn't hurting my feelings. That was expressing your genuine opinion about my worth." I was under stress. Dick's friends were there, and I wanted to make a good impression. "You made an impression by throwing me under the bus for their entertainment." She started crying then, the practiced tears of someone who'd learned to use emotion as a tool of manipulation. But I'd spent years in situations where tears were meaningless, where survival depended on seeing clearly through emotional noise. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm really, truly sorry. Please just give me another chance." "What exactly are you sorry for?" I asked. The question stopped her tears immediately. She looked at me like I'd asked her to solve calculus, genuinely confused about what response I was looking for. "I'm sorry for what I said at the party." "What about the years before the party? What about dismissing my career, taking my money while calling my work worthless, treating me like a backup plan instead of a daughter?" "That's not fair," she said, her voice hardening. "I raised you. I supported your dreams. I never asked you for money, you offered it." The rewriting of history was breathtaking in its completeness. In her version of events, she'd been a supportive mother whose daughter had volunteered financial assistance out of gratitude and love. The phone calls demanding help with bills, the guilt trips about her financial struggles, the casual assumption that my deployments should be scheduled around her convenience had all disappeared from her memory. "You need to leave," I said. "Don't do this," she said, the tears starting again. "Don't throw away our whole relationship over one mistake." But it hadn't been one mistake. It had been a pattern of behavior that I'd enabled for years by accepting her treatment and providing the support she demanded. The party had just been the moment when her private dismissal became public humiliation, forcing me to confront what I'd been tolerating. I closed the door and listened to her knock for another 5 minutes before giving up and leaving. That evening, Dick called. "She's devastated," he said without preamble. "She should be. This is tearing our marriage apart. She can't understand why you won't accept her apology. Her apology doesn't include taking responsibility for anything except the party. She wants to go back to the way things were before, where she gets the benefits of having me as a daughter without treating me with basic respect." "What would it take?" he asked. "What would real accountability look like to you?" The question surprised me with its directness, but I had an answer ready. Acknowledgement of the pattern, not just the incident. Understanding of what my service actually means, not just what other people think of it. And changed behavior, not just changed words. That's a lot to ask. It's the minimum requirement for any relationship worth having. Dick was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if she's capable of that level of self-examination. Then she's not capable of having an adult relationship with me." The conversation ended with mutual understanding, but no resolution. Dick couldn't fix what my mother had broken, and I wouldn't pretend it was fixable just to make everyone more comfortable. For the first time since childhood, I was setting the terms of my own relationships rather than accepting whatever treatment was offered. The change was uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it was also necessary. Some damage can't be undone with apologies. Some relationships can't survive the truth about what they really were. 2 months later, I received orders for a new assignment, commanding officer of a joint special operations unit based in Virginia. The promotion came with increased responsibility, a significant pay raise, and the kind of recognition that marked a successful military career trajectory. I called my Aunt Rachel to share the news, knowing she would understand its significance even if she couldn't discuss the details with anyone else. "Commanding officer," she repeated, her voice warm with genuine pride. "That's a big deal, isn't it?" "It's the kind of assignment people spend their entire careers working toward," I said. "Your mother should know about this." The suggestion hung in the air between us. Rachel had maintained careful neutrality throughout the family drama, but she'd also made it clear that she thought permanent estrangement was a waste of relationships that could be repaired with effort from both sides. "She's gotten a job," Rachel continued. "Full-time, at the hospital. Administrative work, but it pays well enough that she doesn't need help with bills anymore." The information was meant to signal change, evidence that my mother had made practical adjustments to live within her actual means rather than depending on my contributions. It was progress, but it didn't address the underlying issues that had made our relationship unsustainable. "Dick says she's been reading everything she can find about naval special warfare," Rachel added. "Military history, mission reports, casualty statistics. She's trying to understand what your work actually involves." This was also progress, but it came 2 years too late. My mother's newfound interest in my career was motivated by social necessity rather than genuine curiosity. She was learning about my service because her ignorance had become socially awkward, not because she wanted to understand her daughter better. "She knows she handled things badly," Rachel said. "But she doesn't know how to fix it without losing face." "Maybe she needs to lose face," I said. "Maybe that's the only way she'll learn that her behavior has consequences she can't control." Rachel was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of permanent family separation. "You're doing well without her," she said finally. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Better than I've done in years." The truth was that my life had improved dramatically since cutting ties with my mother. Without the constant background stress of managing her emotions and financial crises, I'd been able to focus entirely on my professional development. My performance evaluations had been outstanding, my leadership skills had expanded, and my reputation within the special operations community had continued to grow. The promotion to commanding officer was recognition of that growth, validation that I could handle complex leadership challenges without the distraction of dysfunctional family dynamics. But success had also brought perspective. I could see clearly now how much energy I'd wasted over the years trying to earn approval from someone who was fundamentally incapable of giving it. My mother had needed me to be less successful than her own aspirations in order to feel comfortable with our relationship, and no amount of achievement would have changed that dynamic. The Black Widow wasn't just a military call sign anymore. It was a reminder of my ability to survive in situations where survival wasn't guaranteed. That included surviving the loss of relationships that had never been as supportive as they'd appeared. My new command would involve leading teams in operations where success depended on trust, confidence, and mutual respect. Those were qualities that had to be earned through consistent performance under pressure, not demanded through emotional manipulation or family obligation. I thought about the people I'd be working with, the men and women who would look to me for leadership in situations where decisions had life-or-death consequences. They would judge me by my ability to bring them home safely, to make sound tactical decisions under pressure, to maintain operational security while accomplishing mission objectives. None of them would care about my family drama or my mother's opinion of my career choices. What mattered was my track record, my judgment, and my commitment to the people under my command. For the first time in my adult life, I was moving toward a professional environment where my value would be determined entirely by my performance rather than my willingness to accept treatment I didn't deserve. The call sign that had embarrassed my mother at Dick's party had become the foundation of a career that exceeded every expectation I'd had when I first enlisted. The disappointment she'd announced to 30 strangers had evolved into leadership responsibility that most military officers never achieved. I'd stopped trying to prove my worth to someone who had no interest in seeing it, and in doing so, I discovered that my worth didn't depend on her recognition. The promotion orders were dated for 3 months out, giving me time to complete my current assignment and transition to my new command. I would spend those months working with people who understood the language of duty and sacrifice, who measured success by mission accomplishment rather than social acceptance. When I took command of my new unit, I would introduce myself by my rank and my record, not by my family relationships or personal history. The people I led would know me as someone who'd earned their respect through demonstrated confidence, not inherited loyalty through blood relation. That felt like the right foundation for the next phase of my career and for the rest of my life. The transition to my new command began 3 weeks before my official start date. I spent those weeks at the Pentagon, attending briefings and meeting with senior leadership about the strategic objectives of Joint Task Force Alpha, the unit I would be commanding. The conversations were conducted in the formal, precise language of military planning, focused on operational capabilities, resource allocation, and mission parameters. It was a relief to work in an environment where every interaction was professional, where respect was automatic based on rank and record, and where personal relationships didn't complicate professional responsibilities. The officers I met with knew my reputation from previous assignments, but they judged me based on my ability to contribute to strategic planning rather than my family dynamics or social connections. Colonel Patricia Morrison, my immediate superior, was a 25-year veteran who'd commanded similar units in Iraq and Afghanistan. During our initial meeting, she outlined the challenges I'd be facing: a team of 36 operators from different service branches, ongoing missions in 3 separate theaters, and political pressure to demonstrate measurable results within the first 6 months of my command. "This isn't a typical SEAL team leadership role," she explained. "You'll be coordinating Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, Air Force Special Operations, and Navy SEALs in joint operations. Each group has different training, different protocols, and different ideas about how special operations should be conducted." The complexity was exactly what I'd been preparing for throughout my career. My experience working with different military branches during deployments had taught me how to translate between service cultures, how to build trust across organizational boundaries, and how to focus teams on mission objectives rather than inter-service rivalries. "What's the current team dynamic?" I asked. "Fragmented," Colonel Morrison said bluntly. The previous commander tried to impose SEAL protocols on everyone, which created resentment and reduced operational effectiveness. "We need someone who can build consensus without compromising standards." Building consensus was a leadership skill I'd learned through necessity rather than formal training. Years of managing my mother's emotional crises while maintaining my own professional responsibilities had taught me how to navigate competing demands, how to establish boundaries without creating unnecessary conflict, and how to maintain focus on long-term objectives while dealing with immediate pressures. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family dysfunction I'd finally escaped had actually prepared me for complex leadership challenges. My first day as commanding officer began at 0500 with a unit formation on the parade ground outside our headquarters building. 36 operators stood in precise rows, their uniforms reflecting the different services they represented, but their bearing uniformly professional. These were people who'd volunteered for the most demanding assignments in military service, who'd survived selection processes designed to eliminate anyone who couldn't function under extreme pressure. "I'm Commander Pauline Wilkins," I said, my voice carrying across the formation without need for amplification. "You know me by reputation as the Black Widow. Over the next 6 months, you'll know me by performance as your commanding officer." The introduction was deliberate. My call sign carried weight in the special operations community, recognition of successful missions under impossible conditions. But call signs were earned in the past, leadership was demonstrated in the present. I needed these operators to respect my record while trusting my judgment in situations they hadn't faced yet. "This unit exists to accomplish missions that single service teams can't handle alone," I continued. "That requires coordination, communication, and commitment to team success over individual recognition. Anyone who can't work within those parameters is welcome to request transfer to a different assignment." No one moved. The stillness wasn't surprising. These operators had volunteered for Joint Task Force Alpha because they wanted the challenge of complex, multi-service operations. They understood that success would depend on their ability to function as a unified team rather than representatives of their individual services. But understanding the concept and implementing it effectively were different challenges. Over the following weeks, I discovered that the unit's previous problems went deeper than simple inter-service rivalry. The operators had been organized into service-specific sub-teams, with Army Rangers working exclusively with other Rangers, Marines staying with Marines, and so forth. This structure had created information silos, reduced cross-training opportunities, and limited the tactical flexibility that made joint operations valuable. My first major decision was to reorganize the entire unit into mixed service teams of 6 operators each. Each team would include personnel from at least 3 different services, forcing them to learn each other's capabilities and develop integrated operational procedures. The change was met with predictable resistance. "This is going to reduce our effectiveness," said Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a Marine Force recon veteran with 12 years of experience. "We know how to work with our own people. Starting over with strangers is going to get someone killed." The concern was legitimate. Military units developed operational effectiveness through repeated training and shared experience, building the kind of trust that allowed split-second decision-making in life-or-death situations. Disrupting established team dynamics carried real risks, but maintaining the status quo carried different risks. Joint operations required the ability to adapt to changing conditions, to integrate capabilities from different services, and to function effectively when normal command structures were disrupted. Units that couldn't operate outside their comfort zones were limited in the missions they could accept and the results they could achieve. "You're right that trust takes time to build," I told Rodriguez during our private conversation after the formation. "But we have time. Our next deployment isn't for 3 months, which gives us 12 weeks to develop new team dynamics through intensive training." "What if it doesn't work?" he asked. "Then we adjust the approach until it does work. But we don't go back to the old system that was already failing." The training schedule I implemented was deliberately aggressive. Mixed teams conducted daily exercises in different environments, from urban warfare simulations to wilderness survival scenarios. The operators were forced to rely on each other's expertise, to learn new communication protocols, and to develop trust through shared challenge rather than shared service background. The process wasn't smooth. Personality conflicts emerged, communication breakdowns caused mission failures during training exercises, and several operators requested transfers rather than adapt to the new system. But gradually, the mixed teams began developing their own operational rhythms, combining techniques from different services into more flexible tactical approaches. The breakthrough came during a training exercise that simulated a hostage rescue in a multi-story building. The scenario required precise coordination between assault teams, sniper support, and explosive specialists, with real-time communication between operators from 4 different services. Team Alpha, led by Army Ranger Captain James Park and including Marines, SEALs, and Air Force specialists, executed the mission with textbook precision. They adapted their approach 3 times during the exercise as conditions changed, with each operator contributing specialized knowledge to the team's tactical decisions. The result was a successful outcome that would have been impossible using single-service protocols. That's how joint operations are supposed to work, Colonel Morrison observed during the post-exercise briefing. Different capabilities combined into something more effective than the sum of its parts. The success created momentum throughout the unit. Operators who'd been skeptical of mixed service teams began requesting specific partnerships with personnel from other services. Training scores improved across all performance metrics. Most importantly, the unit began developing a distinct culture that valued capability over service background, results over process, and team success over individual recognition. 6 weeks into my command, we received our first operational assignment, a counterterrorism mission in Syria that required simultaneous operations in 3 separate locations. The complexity demanded exactly the kind of multi-service coordination we'd been training for, with assault teams, intelligence gathering, and air support all operating under unified command while adapting to rapidly changing conditions on the ground. The mission was classified at levels that prevented me from sharing details with family members, but the operational success was measurable in ways that mattered to the special operations community. We achieved all primary objectives with 0 casualties, extracted valuable intelligence that led to follow-up operations, and demonstrated the effectiveness of joint special operations units in complex combat environments. More importantly, the success validated the leadership approach I developed through years of navigating difficult relationships and impossible situations. Building trust required consistent performance over time, establishing boundaries required clear communication of expectations, and maintaining effectiveness required focusing on objectives rather than interpersonal dynamics. These were lessons I'd learned while managing my mother's emotional demands and financial crises, skills I developed while trying to maintain professional focus despite family dysfunction. The experience had been painful and ultimately unsustainable as a personal relationship, but it had prepared me for leadership challenges that required similar navigation of competing demands and conflicting priorities. The irony was that my mother's dismissal of my military career had actually contributed to the development of capabilities that made me effective in this command role. Years of minimizing my achievements while depending on my support had taught me how to maintain focus on long-term objectives despite immediate criticism, how to perform effectively without external validation, and how to establish boundaries that protected my ability to function professionally. The woman who'd called me nothing but a disappointment had unknowingly helped prepare me for the most challenging and rewarding assignment of my military career. 3 months into my command, the dynamic between my personal and professional lives shifted in an unexpected way. I was reviewing mission reports in my office when my aide informed me that I had a visitor requesting an audience, Colonel Richard Hayes, USMC Ret. Dick appeared in my doorway wearing civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the formal bearing that never quite disappeared from career military officers. His request for a meeting had come through official channels, complete with security clearance verification and appointment scheduling through my administrative staff. "Colonel Hayes," I said, standing to acknowledge his visit. "This is unexpected." "Commander Wilkins," he replied, his tone respectful but serious. "Thank you for seeing me. I have a request that involves both personal and professional considerations." He explained that he'd been asked to serve on a Department of Defense advisory committee focused on joint special operations effectiveness. The committee was tasked with evaluating current programs and making recommendations for future development, work that would involve interviewing commanders of active joint units and reviewing operational reports from recent missions. "I recommended that the committee prioritize interviewing you about your command of Joint Task Force Alpha," he said. Your unit's performance metrics are exceptional, and your approach to multi-service integration could inform policy decisions at the highest levels of military leadership. The recommendation was professionally significant. Advisory committee reports influenced funding decisions, training protocols, and strategic planning throughout the Department of Defense. Having my command methods evaluated and potentially adopted by other units would represent recognition at a level that few officers achieved during their careers. But Dick's involvement complicated the professional opportunity with personal considerations that I'd been avoiding for months. I want you to know that this recommendation is based entirely on your professional record, he continued. It has nothing to do with my relationship with your mother or our family situation. Your unit's success speaks for itself. The clarification was necessary but also revealing. Dick understood that his connection to my family could be perceived as favoritism or conflict of interest, potentially undermining the credibility of any recognition that followed from his recommendation. His willingness to address the issue directly suggested genuine respect for professional boundaries. "What does my mother think about your involvement in advancing my career?" I asked. Dick's expression tightened slightly. "She doesn't know about the committee appointment yet. Our relationship has been difficult since the situation with you developed." The admission confirmed what my Aunt Rachel had hinted at during our recent conversations. My mother's marriage to Dick was experiencing strain that went beyond simple disagreement about family dynamics. The fundamental differences in their values, revealed by the conflict over my service record, had created broader problems in their relationship. "She expected you to choose family loyalty over professional respect," I said. "She expected me to pretend that her treatment of you was acceptable," Dick corrected. "When I couldn't do that, she accused me of caring more about military relationships than our marriage." The situation had forced Dick to choose between enabling my mother's behavior and maintaining his integrity as someone who understood what military service meant. His choice to recommend me for committee evaluation demonstrated where his priorities lay, but it had come at personal cost. "I'm sorry this has affected your marriage," I said. "Don't apologize for other people's choices," Dick replied. "Your mother created this situation by refusing to acknowledge what your service record represents. I can't pretend to respect someone who publicly dismisses accomplishments that I know required extraordinary sacrifice and skill." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering the committee's timeline, the evaluation process, and the potential impact on future joint operations policy. Throughout the discussion, Dick maintained complete professionalism, focusing on the strategic value of my command experience rather than the family dynamics that had brought us to this point. But as he prepared to leave, he addressed the personal situation directly. "She misses you," he said. "She talks about wanting to rebuild your relationship, but she can't figure out how to do it without admitting that she was fundamentally wrong about your career and your worth as her daughter." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "She wants the relationship without accepting responsibility for why it ended." "I know. And I can't help her with that because it would require me to minimize your achievements, which I won't do." The committee evaluation process began 2 weeks later with a comprehensive review of Joint Task Force Alpha's operational reports, training protocols, and performance metrics. 3 retired general officers and 2 active duty colonels spent 4 days observing our training exercises, interviewing team leaders, and analyzing our mission success rates compared to traditional single-service units. The evaluation was thorough and professional, focused on tactical effectiveness rather than command personality or leadership style. The committee members asked detailed questions about resource allocation, inter-service coordination challenges, and the measurable benefits of mixed service team composition. Their preliminary findings were encouraging. Joint Task Force Alpha had achieved mission success rates 15% higher than comparable single-service units, with significantly lower casualty rates and more efficient resource utilization. The training protocols I'd implemented had reduced inter-service friction while improving tactical flexibility and operational adaptability. "Your approach to joint command represents a significant advancement in special operations effectiveness," the committee chair told me during their exit briefing. "We're recommending that your methods be studied for potential implementation across all joint special operations units." The recommendation would mean expanded responsibility, likely promotion to full colonel, and the opportunity to influence special operations policy at the strategic level. It represented the kind of career advancement that most military officers spent decades working toward, recognition that validated every sacrifice I'd made in service of my country. More importantly, it confirmed that my value as a military officer was determined by measurable results rather than family approval or social acceptance. The skills I'd developed through years of navigating impossible situations had translated into professional capabilities that served my country and advanced my career on merit rather than connections. That evening, I called my Aunt Rachel to share the news about the committee evaluation and its potential implications for my career trajectory. "Your mother should hear about this," Rachel said after I'd explained the significance of the recommendation. "She can read about it in the newspapers if it becomes public," I replied. "She's proud of you," Rachel insisted. "She just doesn't know how to express it without admitting she was wrong about everything. Being proud of me now doesn't change the fact that she spent years actively working against my success," I said. Recognition that comes only after other people force you to see someone's value isn't genuine pride. It's social conformity. The distinction mattered to me more than Rachel understood. My mother's newfound interest in my achievements was motivated by external pressure rather than personal growth, by social embarrassment rather than genuine understanding. That kind of conditional acceptance wasn't worth the emotional cost of rebuilding a relationship that had been fundamentally exploitative. My mother started dating Colonel Richard Hayes 3 months after her divorce was finalized. She met him at a charity fundraiser for veterans, the kind of event she attended more for networking than genuine concern. Within 2 weeks, she was calling him Dick with practiced familiarity, and by the 3rd week, she'd moved him into her townhouse. "He's distinguished," she told me over the phone, her voice carrying that particular breathiness she reserved for impressing people. "A decorated colonel. 28 years of service. You should see his ribbons." I was in Kandahar when she called, sitting in a prefab building that smelled like diesel and dust. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept my mouth shut. My mother had always preferred her heroes at a comfortable distance. The first time I met Dick was at Sunday dinner, 3 weeks into their relationship. He sat at the head of my mother's dining table like he'd been there for years, carving the roast with military precision. My mother hovered beside him, refilling his wine glass before it was empty. "Tell Dick about your work," she said, the way you might ask a child to recite their times tables. "I'm in the Navy," I said. "She's in the service," my mother corrected, as if I'd misspoken. "It's temporary. She'll figure out what she really wants to do eventually." Dick nodded politely, but I caught something in his eyes. A flicker of professional interest, maybe recognition. He didn't ask questions, though. My mother had already moved on to discussing his latest golf handicap. Over the following months, the pattern solidified. My mother would call me with updates about Dick's achievements, his connections, his opinions on everything from foreign policy to wine selection. Meanwhile, my own work became increasingly invisible in our conversations. "Don't embarrass me," she said before Dick's birthday party. "These are important people." His former colleagues, their wives. "They're not used to your type." My type. I was a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy SEALs, but in my mother's living room, I was just another disappointment in civilian clothes. The birthday party was a masterclass in my mother's social choreography. She'd invited 30 people, all carefully selected to showcase Dick's importance and her good fortune in landing him. The guest list included retired military brass, local politicians, and what my mother called society people, wives of successful men who spent their days organizing charity luncheons. I arrived in a simple black dress, my hair pulled back in a regulation bun that I never quite learned to soften for civilian events. My mother greeted me at the door with a tight smile and a warning squeeze of my arm. "Remember what we discussed," she whispered. The party was in full swing when my mother decided to make her formal introductions. She positioned herself in the center of the living room, champagne glass raised, commanding attention with practiced ease. "I want you all to meet the most important man in my life," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. Dick stood beside her, uncomfortable with the attention but allowing it. "Colonel Richard Hayes." This is what success looks like." The guests murmured appreciatively. Someone started to clap. My mother basked in the reflected glory, her smile radiant. Then her gaze found me, standing near the bookshelf with my untouched wine. The smile shifted, became something colder. "And this is my daughter," she said, her tone dropping several degrees. "She's nothing but a disappointment." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt 30 pairs of eyes turn toward me, some curious, others embarrassed by the casual cruelty. My mother's neighbor, Mrs. Chin, looked down at her shoes. My cousin Shelley's mouth fell open slightly. But it was Dick's reaction that stopped the room cold. He'd been in the process of accepting congratulations, shaking hands, and nodding modestly. When his eyes found me across the room, the color drained from his face. His hand, extended toward another guest, began to tremble. "That's the Black Widow of the Seals," he whispered, loud enough for the people nearest him to hear. The room went silent. My mother's smile faltered, confusion replacing her confident cruelty. She looked between Dick and me, trying to understand what had just happened. "I'm sorry," she said. Dick didn't answer. He was staring at me with something approaching awe, his military bearing suddenly rigid with respect. I'd seen that look before, in briefing rooms and on bases, from men who knew what the call sign meant. Mrs. Chen's husband, a Korean War veteran, was the first to understand. He straightened in his chair, studying me with new eyes. Then Mr. Peterson from down the street, who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam. One by one, the veterans in the room began to connect the dots. My mother stood in the center of it all, still holding her champagne, still wearing the remains of her triumphant smile. But the narrative had slipped from her control, and for the first time in my adult life, I watched her struggle to regain it. "What's a Black Widow?" she asked, her voice smaller now. Dick finally looked away from me, turning to my mother with something like pity in his eyes. "It's a call sign," he said quietly. "Earned in operations where survival odds were essentially 0. The Black Widow brings her people home." My mother blinked, processing this information. Around the room, conversations had resumed in whispers. The party continued, but the tone had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the disappointing daughter tucked away in the corner. I was something else entirely, something my mother didn't understand and couldn't control. I finished my wine and set the glass on the bookshelf. As I moved toward the door, Dick stepped into my path. "Ma'am," he said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. "It's an honor." I nodded once, the way I might acknowledge a fellow officer. Then I walked out of my mother's house, leaving her to explain to her guests why her greatest disappointment had just become the most interesting person in the room. The drive home gave me time to think, but not about Dick's recognition or the whispered conversations I'd left behind. What stuck with me was the moment before all that, when my mother looked at 30 of her closest friends and acquaintances and called me nothing but a disappointment. It wasn't the first time she'd cut me down, but it was the first time she'd done it so publicly, with such casual precision. Standing there in her living room, surrounded by people who mattered to her, she'd chosen to diminish me for the entertainment of her guests. I thought about the years before I enlisted, when I was still trying to be the daughter she wanted. High school honor roll, college scholarship, all the external markers of success that should have made her proud. But it was never enough. There was always something missing, some essential quality I lacked that made her sigh when introducing me to her friends. "She's very serious," she'd say, as if that were a character flaw. Or, "She doesn't really know what she wants to do with her life," even when I did. The criticism followed me through college, through my decision to enlist, through the years of training that nearly broke me. While I was learning to survive in conditions that would have killed most people, my mother was telling anyone who would listen that I was wasting my potential. All that education, she'd say to her sister during their weekly phone calls, her voice carrying through the thin walls of our apartment during my rare visits home. And she's running around in the desert playing soldier. Playing soldier. As if the months in Afghanistan, the missions in Syria, the operations I couldn't name or describe were some elaborate game of dress-up. The money I sent home wasn't play, though. The checks I wrote to help with her mortgage, to pay for her car repairs, to cover the gap between her part-time job and her expenses. That money came from hazard pay, from combat deployment bonuses, from the compensation the Navy provided for putting your life on the line in service of your country. She cashed every check without question, but the source remained invisible to her. In her mind, I was still the disappointing daughter who'd chosen a temporary distraction over a real career. I'd missed her birthday 3 years running because of deployments. Each time, I'd sent flowers and called when I could, sometimes from time zones where her birthday was already over. She'd forgiven me with the particular martyrdom she'd perfected over the years. "I understand," she'd say, her voice heavy with resignation. "Your work comes first." But it wasn't about work coming first. It was about being unable to explain that I was in places where communication was impossible, doing things that couldn't be discussed over international phone lines. The secrecy that protected operational security also protected my mother from understanding what her daughter actually did for a living. Maybe that was easier for her. Maybe it was simpler to believe I was choosing my career over my family, rather than acknowledging that her daughter was serving in ways that required real sacrifice. The night of Dick's party, I sat in my apartment and replayed not just the humiliation, but all the smaller moments that had led to it. The Christmas dinner where she'd introduced me to her book club friends as still figuring things out. The wedding where she'd apologized to distant relatives for my inability to settle down like normal women my age. Each incident had been a small cut, easy to dismiss or explain away. But together, they formed a pattern of casual dismissal that I'd been accepting for years. I thought about my teammates, the men and women who served alongside me in conditions where trust wasn't just professional courtesy, but literal survival. They knew me by my call sign, by my record, by the decisions I made under pressure. To them, I was reliable, competent, someone they could count on when everything went wrong. But in my mother's living room, I was nothing but a disappointment. The phone started ringing around 10 o'clock. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to my mother's increasingly frantic messages. "I don't know what happened tonight," she said in the first one. "Dick won't explain what all that military stuff means. Call me back." The second message was more demanding. "You left without saying goodbye. That was incredibly rude, especially after I invited you." The third message revealed her growing panic. "Mrs. Chin asked me about your service record. I don't know what to tell people. This is embarrassing." I deleted all 3 without returning her calls. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't going to rush in to manage my mother's discomfort. I wasn't going to explain away her behavior or help her craft a narrative that made her look good. She'd made her choice in front of those 30 people, and now she could live with the consequences. The decision felt strange, like stepping off familiar ground into uncertain territory. But it also felt necessary. My mother had spent years training me to minimize myself for her comfort, and tonight I'd finally seen the cost of that arrangement. I wasn't nothing but a disappointment. I was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, with a record of service that earned respect from people who understood what it meant. The fact that my mother chose not to see that didn't make it less true. It just made her choice more revealing than mine. Growing up, my mother and I had been a team of 2 against the world. My father left when I was 7, disappearing into a new life in another state with barely a forwarding address. For years after that, it was just us in the small apartment on Maple Street, figuring out how to pay bills and keep food on the table. I learned early how to be useful. While other kids were at soccer practice or sleepovers, I was at the laundromat, folding clothes and feeding quarters into the machines. I learned to grocery shop with coupons and calculate unit prices in my head. When the car broke down, I was the one who called mechanics for quotes and figured out which repairs we could afford to delay. "You're my little helper," my mother would say, and back then, it felt like praise. But somewhere along the way, being useful became being invisible. My achievements were her achievements, proof of her good parenting. My failures were character flaws, disappointments she'd somehow failed to prevent. The line between helping and being responsible for her happiness blurred until I couldn't tell the difference. When I got into college on an ROTC scholarship, my mother told everyone it was because she'd raised me to be responsible. When I graduated summa cum laude, she took credit for pushing me to study. But when I chose to accept my commission instead of going to law school like she'd hoped, suddenly my decisions were my own again. "I didn't raise you to waste your education," she said the day before I left for officer candidate school. The military gave me something I'd never had at home: clear expectations and honest feedback. In training, you succeeded or failed based on your own performance. No one cared about your family dynamics or your mother's social aspirations. You either met the standard or you didn't, and the consequences were immediate and transparent. I thrived in that environment. The physical demands that broke other candidates felt manageable after years of carrying my family's emotional weight. The mental pressure was intense but clean, unlike the subtle manipulation I'd grown up navigating. When instructors yelled, they meant it, and when they praised you, you'd earned it. The SEAL pipeline was different from regular Navy training. The attrition rate was brutal, designed to eliminate everyone except those who could function under impossible conditions. Most of my class dropped out during Hell Week, and I understood why. The sleep deprivation, the physical exhaustion, the constant mental pressure would have broken the person I'd been in civilian life. But I wasn't that person anymore. Every cold ocean swim, every impossible obstacle course, every evolution designed to make us quit felt like practice for something I'd been doing all my life: surviving situations that should have been too much to handle. My call sign came during my first deployment to Afghanistan. Our target was a high-value compound in a region where intelligence suggested the survival rate for extraction teams was less than 30%. 3 previous attempts had failed, with significant casualties each time. "This is a Black Widow mission," our commanding officer told us during the briefing. "Low probability of success, high probability of casualties. Anyone who wants out can say so now without prejudice." No one moved. We'd all volunteered for this work, and backing down wasn't an option any of us considered. The operation went sideways from the moment we hit the ground. Our intel was wrong, the compound was better defended than expected, and our extraction point was compromised within the first hour. By standard protocols, the mission should have been aborted with significant losses. Instead, I found a way to turn the situation around. Not through heroics or dramatic gestures, but through the kind of methodical problem-solving I'd learned as a child when adult problems became my responsibility. We adapted, we improvised, and we brought everyone home alive with the target secured. "Black Widow," my team leader said afterward, and the name stuck. Over the years, it became more than just a call sign. It became a reputation, a brand of reliability under impossible conditions. When other teams had failed, when the odds were stacked against success, when commanders needed someone who could find a way through situations that looked hopeless, they called for the Black Widow. I never told my mother about the missions that earned me that reputation. Operational security was part of it, but not all of it. How do you explain to someone who's never faced real consequences that you spend your professional life in situations where failure means people die? How do you tell someone who measures success by social acceptance that your value is measured by your ability to bring people home from places where survival isn't guaranteed? My mother's world was charity fundraisers and neighborhood politics, where the stakes were reputation and social standing. My world was counterterrorism operations and hostage rescues, where the stakes were human lives and national security. We spoke different languages, lived by different rules, measured success by completely different standards. For years, I'd tried to bridge that gap by minimizing my work and maximizing her comfort. I'd let her dismiss my career as playing soldier because explaining the truth would have required her to acknowledge a reality she preferred to ignore. But standing in her living room, watching her reduce everything I'd accomplished to nothing but a disappointment, I finally understood the cost of that compromise. I wasn't disappointed in myself. I was proud of what I'd built, proud of the people I'd served with, proud of the missions I'd completed. The disappointment was entirely hers, based on her inability to see value in anything that didn't serve her own needs. For the first time in my adult life, I realized that wasn't my problem to solve. The morning after Dick's party, I woke up with unusual clarity about what needed to change. No more automatic transfers to my mother's checking account. No more emergency loans for car repairs or medical bills. No more dropping everything to solve crises that somehow always coincided with my leave time. The pattern had been so established that I'd never questioned it. Every month, $500 moved from my account to hers, supplementing her part-time income and maintaining the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to during her brief marriage to my stepfather. When larger expenses arose, she called me first, before checking with friends or family or considering whether she could actually afford whatever she was buying. I'd enabled this arrangement by treating it as family obligation rather than financial dependence. But sitting at my kitchen table, calculating how much I'd sent her over the past 5 years, I realized I'd been subsidizing someone who publicly dismissed the source of that support. The decision to stop wasn't emotional. It was practical, like cutting supply lines to an operation that was no longer strategically viable. My mother noticed immediately. "The transfer didn't go through," she said when she called Tuesday morning. "There must be some kind of banking error." "No error," I said. "I stopped the automatic payment." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "What do you mean, stopped it?" she asked finally. "I mean, I'm not sending money anymore. But I'm counting on that money. You know my situation." I did know her situation. She worked 20 hours a week at a dentist's office, more by choice than necessity, and supplemented that income with my contributions and occasional help from my aunt. She could have worked full-time, could have downsized from the townhouse to something more affordable, could have made any number of practical adjustments to live within her actual means. Instead, she'd structured her life around my willingness to cover the gap between her desires and her income. "You'll figure something out," I said. The phone calls escalated over the following days. First came guilt. "I sacrificed everything to raise you." Then anger. "You're being incredibly selfish." Finally, manipulation. "Fine. I guess I'll just lose the house." I listened to each voicemail, deleted it, and went about my day. The emotional hooks that had worked for years had somehow lost their power. When someone calls you nothing but a disappointment in front of 30 people, their subsequent appeals to family loyalty ring hollow. But it was Dick's response that surprised me. The envelope arrived Friday, addressed in careful handwriting to my apartment. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery with the Marine Corps letterhead embossed at the top. "Lieutenant Commander," it read. "I owe you an apology and an explanation. Your mother has been telling people that your military service was a phase, something you'd outgrow when you found real work. I should have corrected her, but I didn't want to cause problems in their relationship. After Sunday night, I realized my silence was a disservice to you and to every service member who's earned the respect your record deserves. If there's anything I can do to make amends, please let me know. Respectfully, Colonel Richard Hayes, USMC, Ret." I read the note twice, then set it aside. Dick's apology was appreciated, but it didn't change the fundamental problem. My mother hadn't been misinformed about my career. She'd been willfully ignorant. The information was available if she'd wanted it. The choice to minimize my service was deliberate. She called again that evening, her strategy shifting to include Dick in the conversation. "Dick thinks very highly of you," she said, as if this were news. "He says you have quite a reputation in military circles." I know what Dick thinks. He's been telling me about call signs and operations, and all sorts of things I never understood. Why didn't you ever explain any of this to me? The question struck me as fundamentally dishonest. I'd tried to explain, in general terms, what my work involved. She'd dismissed those explanations as bragging or self-importance. When I'd mentioned deployments, she'd changed the subject. When I'd talked about training or missions, her eyes had glazed over with boredom. "You never wanted to understand," I said. "That's not true. I just didn't know it was so important." Important. As if importance were determined by other people's recognition rather than the actual stakes involved. "Don't ruin this for me," she said, and there was panic in her voice. "Dick respects you, and I don't know why, but he does. Just don't make me look bad." The conversation ended there. Not because I hung up, but because we'd reached the core of her concern. She wasn't worried about understanding my work or rebuilding our relationship. She was worried about how my reaction to her public humiliation might affect her standing with Dick. Even her apology, when it finally came, was really about protecting her image. I spent the weekend thinking about boundaries, about the difference between family loyalty and family dysfunction. My teammates talked about their families with pride, with mutual respect, with the kind of love that didn't require constant sacrifice from one person to maintain another's comfort. That wasn't what I had with my mother, and it wasn't what I wanted anymore. Monday morning, I wrote a response to Dick's note. Brief, professional, accepting his apology without embracing him as an ally. He'd been complicit in my mother's narrative for months, and while his recognition at the party had been validating, it didn't erase his earlier silence. Then I blocked my mother's number and changed my banking passwords. The decision felt strange, like cutting anchor lines before knowing where the current would take you. But for the first time in years, the direction mattered less than the fact that I was finally moving under my own power. My mother's marriage to Dick began showing cracks within weeks of his party. It started with small things that filtered back to me through my Aunt Rachel, who maintained relationships with both sides of family drama through careful neutrality and strategic information sharing. Your mother's been asking a lot of questions about military ranks, Rachel told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. She wants to know if you outranked Dick somehow. The question revealed my mother's fundamental misunderstanding of military hierarchy. Dick had been a colonel in the Marine Corps. I was a lieutenant commander in the Navy. The services were different, our career paths were different, and direct comparison was meaningless. But to my mother, rank was just another form of social status, and she was trying to figure out where everyone stood in her personal pecking order. She's been researching SEAL teams, Rachel continued. Printing articles from the internet, asking me if I knew what you actually did for work. This was new. For years, my mother had actively avoided learning about my career. Now, faced with Dick's obvious respect and her guests' curious questions, she was scrambling to understand what she'd been dismissing. But her research was yielding uncomfortable truths. SEAL operations weren't the running around in the desert she described to her friends. The casualty rates, the selection process, the operational requirements were all matters of public record, and they painted a picture of service that was difficult to minimize or dismiss. According to Rachel, my mother had spent an entire afternoon reading about naval special warfare casualties in Afghanistan. The statistics were sobering enough to read in abstract, connecting them to someone you knew was different. She asked me if you'd ever been shot, Rachel said quietly. I had been shot twice, but that wasn't information I shared with family members who couldn't handle the reality of my work. The wounds had healed, the incidents had been classified, and I'd returned to active duty without discussion or drama. It was part of the job, accepted risk in exchange for mission success. But my mother was discovering that her daughter's temporary phase involved real danger, real sacrifice, and real consequences. The cognitive dissonance between her dismissive narrative and the actual facts was creating problems in her relationship with Dick. He keeps mentioning your service record, Rachel explained. Not in detail, but like it's something she should be proud of. And she doesn't know how to respond because she's spent years telling people the opposite. The situation was further complicated by the reactions of their social circle. Word had spread about the party incident, and my mother was fielding questions she couldn't answer. Mrs. Chin had asked about my deployment schedule. Mr. Peterson wanted to know which operations I'd been involved in. Several of Dick's military friends had expressed interest in meeting me properly. My mother found herself in the unusual position of being unable to control the narrative about her own daughter. For years, she'd shaped how people perceived me through her own commentary and interpretation. But now she was dealing with people who had their own understanding of military service, their own respect for what my record represented. She doesn't like feeling ignorant, Rachel said. And she really doesn't like Dick knowing more about your career than she does. The tension was affecting their relationship in ways that went beyond social awkwardness. Dick had built a life around military values, service, sacrifice, honor, and respect for those who'd earned it through action rather than aspiration. Discovering that his wife had spent years publicly diminishing someone with my record was challenging his fundamental assumptions about her character. Meanwhile, my absence from family functions was becoming increasingly noticeable. I'd stopped attending Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, and social events where my mother and Dick would be present together. The empty chair at family tables was generating its own conversations. People are asking where you are, Rachel told me. Your mother says you're busy with work, but Dick knows military scheduling better than that. He knows you're choosing not to come. My choice was deliberate. I wasn't interested in helping my mother manage the social fallout from her own behavior. She'd created this situation by choosing to humiliate me publicly. She could solve it without my assistance. But my absence was also sending a message to everyone who'd witnessed her attack at the party. While she was scrambling to rebuild a narrative that made her look reasonable, I was demonstrating that her behavior had consequences she couldn't control or explain away. The family dynamics were shifting in ways that my mother couldn't navigate. Dick was asking questions about my service that she couldn't answer. Her friends were expressing admiration for accomplishments she'd trained herself not to see. And I was refusing to play my assigned role as the reliable daughter who absorbed criticism and provided support regardless of how I was treated. "She wants to apologize," Rachel said during our most recent conversation. "But she doesn't know how, and she's afraid you won't accept it." The fear was justified. My mother's previous apologies had been strategic, designed to reset our relationship to its previous dysfunction without addressing the underlying problems. She would express regret for her misunderstanding or claim that she'd been under stress when she attacked me, but she'd never acknowledged the pattern of dismissal and financial exploitation that had characterized our relationship for years. A real apology would require her to confront the fact that she'd spent years benefiting from my success while publicly minimizing it. It would mean acknowledging that she'd treated me as a resource rather than a daughter, valued my financial contributions while dismissing the source of my income. Most importantly, it would mean admitting that her love had been conditional on my willingness to accept her judgment about my worth. I wasn't sure she was capable of that level of self-examination. And I wasn't sure I was interested in finding out. For the first time in my adult life, I was living without the constant background noise of my mother's approval or disapproval. My work spoke for itself, my reputation stood on its own merit, and my value wasn't determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. The freedom was intoxicating, and I wasn't eager to give it up for the promise of a relationship that might not actually change. Thanks for staying with me. If this hit home, tap like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. More true boundary-setting stories are coming. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been publicly mocked by family or a partner? What did you do in the moment? Where did you finally draw the line, and what changed after? If you serve or have served, how has that shaped your family dynamics? What's one boundary you wish you'd set sooner? Should I ever give my mother another chance, and what would real accountability look like? Comment where you're tuning in from, share your story below, and send this to someone who needs the reminder. Respect isn't negotiable.